My older cousin has served time, and not only in the military, but also specific branches of government that deal with things hidden to the public eye. He has gone on several diving missions with other very experienced divers, experiencing strange creatures, and nearly dying, but that's for another story that I'll have to tell you later. He has had other run-ins with things that are not supposed to exist, and it's even had a couple Bigfoot counters here and there. But today, I'm going to be telling you about how he had encountered a Dogman nest, or so he tells me, when he had gotten hired by a secret security firm to survey an area of land due to an unforeseen threat, is what they called it. My cousin had been hired several times by multiple companies as a quote-unquote cleanup person. He's kind of a jack of all trades and has had his hands in quite a few endeavors, including being sent out to kill several mountain lions and packs of coyotes, some that were endangering nearby communities' farms and livestock, but then again, that's not the point of why I'm writing to you. My cousin, see, he refuses to tell me the exact location, but says it's somewhere between Ohio and Kentucky, and that he was in the thick of the wilderness surveying this specific area. My cousin wasn't the type of person to ask questions. Usually, he was just given an assignment and an order, and that was it. He was only given a few basic supplies with his most prized tool on a journey, a machete. He made it to a certain point where he told me that he was able to tell, just by the look of the wilderness alone, that man had never stepped in this area before, and that he was the first human to be in those woods. The further he got in, the thicker the brush got, and the harder it became for him to get in. He told me even the atmosphere around him had started to change in a negative way. When asking him what he meant by that exactly, he could only explain that it got harder to breathe, and he could feel the presence of something else, meaning he was not alone. After continuing on further and further, getting closer to the coordinates he was given, he stumbled upon what looked like a large den, half shallow cavern and half built out of dirt. He said it was just kind of there, and the opening was enormous, around 8 to 9 feet high and about 5 feet in width, and was large enough that he could just basically walk in. He said you could just smell death emanating from every corner of this small cave. Being outside the entrance, you could even smell it more. Even though every fiber in his being was screaming to not go in, he said he felt like there was just this mysterious force pulling him in and drawing him in as if he had no control over his own body. Taking his flashlight on and out and gripping his machete, he made his way about 20 feet when the cavern inside opened up to a much larger area. He said if he had to guess, it was probably about 30 feet high, and a room that's roughly 50 yards across from where he was standing to the back wall. He said the smell of rotting animal and wet dog was so bad that he could hardly breathe, and couldn't be in there long. After quickly shining his light around, there were so many bones, he said. He saw so many skulls and bone piles. Animals, of course. He had no doubt in his mind that this was indeed the den of some large predator, probably a wolf or a pack of wolves. He said he was the only one in there for a handful of seconds because, besides the smell, he had this horrible feeling like he just shouldn't be in there and that he should leave now. Quickly exiting the cave, he made his way another 10 or so miles to the designated coordinates he was given, but said he was followed the rest of the way there. He said he could feel the presence of something quickly growing around him. It felt malicious. It became apparent more and more that he needed to get out of there, and quickly, and reach his coordinates. He explained to me that whatever it was following him, was tracking him like prey, but wasn't coming in close enough to reveal itself. He thought that to be odd, considering whatever it was clearly possessed enough strength and stamina to pounce on him and take him down. He believes that whatever it was also lived in the den that he had discovered, and that there were multiple of whatever this was following him wherever he was going. This went on until he reached his coordinated points where a helicopter had come to pick him up after using a special signalized device. Upon being picked up, and as he was going up in the air, he said he looked down and can see these tall, what he would describe as werewolf-looking beings standing and some were crouching just beyond the woodline, invisible if you were on foot, but totally exposed once you were in the air. Because of how spread apart the trees were in this clearing, since it was obviously big enough for a helicopter to land, he was able to see these beings very clearly. Said there was probably about 7 or 8 of them, and that they were pitch black, and instead on 2 legs, and resembled that of what you would see off of a Hollywood horror movie. Frightened, he did keep it to himself, but he told me that this wasn't his first rodeo, since he has had other strange encounters with weird beings like Bigfoot and other stuff. I'll be sure to send you that story about his diving experience and encountering something unknown. I need to start with telling you that I am a no bullshit kind of person. I don't like to lie or make stuff up, and because of my job, I have to be as honest and credible as possible and maintain somewhat of my integrity. I knew that if I told anybody besides you, and maybe a few other people who are open to this, I would probably be mocked and called crazy, so I figured I would give it a shot by telling you this. You can tell me what you think. You seem to know a lot about it, so maybe you can give me some pointers. I truck for a living, and a couple of months back, I hit and killed an animal that I couldn't identify. I did not stick around long enough to truly get a great look at it because I got the feeling that there were potentially more around the area, and that I may have pissed them off by killing one of their kind. I want to say I was somewhere between Illinois and Iowa, and I could tell you it was a long stretch of road, flatlands, and I was the only truck on the road at the time. It was early in the morning, and it was pitch black outside. I'm driving, and all of a sudden, this large black dog steps out on the road and looks right in my direction. When I say steps out, he steps out onto the road as close to where I was that I did not even have time to stop the truck at all, and all I could do was honk the horn. He was standing on 2 legs. It was too late for that though, and I ended up colliding with whatever this 2-legged humanoid dog thing was. I heard the thud and had to pull over immediately to see what happened. So I pull over to the side of the road where there is barely any room to begin with and put my hazards on and grab my trusty flashlight. I run back there, and lying there on the road is this ugly looking thing. I'll tell you when I ain't ever seen anything that looks like this. This animal was ugly. It reminded me of a dog but looked so human-like it was startling. It wasn't too big. I would say maybe 5 feet high if I had to guess when I saw it. My initial reaction was that it was a child or a teenager in a costume, but that just wasn't the case. This thing was maimed up pretty well for my truck, so I did what most people would do and kicked it off the side of the road, not thinking too much of it. When I say this thing was ugly, I really mean that. When it died, part of its lower jaw was broken open, exposing all of its sharp, rigid teeth. I remember I gasped at how many teeth that it had, and it was like I was looking into the mouth of a shark, minus the serrated edges on the teeth. It had a shorter snout, but piercing dull, now lifeless eyes. I sat there and crouched over it, shining my light and scanning over its body to see really what it was and to if I could properly identify what it was I had killed. But I could not. Maybe it was a mutated coyote, or possibly a wolf, but all of its sizes and dimensions were just wrong. Then again, it was maimed pretty good from the truck, and that it was a big, bloody mess. I would say the head was the most intact, and was really the only thing I had to go by trying to figure out what kind of animal this really was. When you and I had spoken about this previously on the phone, you had mentioned to me that it sounded like a Dogman to you, or a juvenile Dogman at that. See, I know virtually nothing about cryptids, or cryptozoology, or creatures that aren't supposed to exist, I should call them, but I can tell you I've never seen an animal that looked this way. The best way I can relay the feeling to you and your viewers, since I'm sure you will be reading this to them, is that it's kind of like seeing a dead lion for the first time if you've only ever seen house cats. You would be confused, amazed, and terrified at the sight of this massive dead animal, but you could tell by somewhat similar relation in size and shape that it was related to a familiar animal that you kind of knew. I think in the moment I probably chalked it up to just a mutated coyote or something, even though it walked out onto the road on two legs. I don't know. I think I was overcome by so much shock about what happened, I didn't really spend too much time with critical thinking. Tried not to get my boot covered in blood, and there really wasn't a good way to push it off the road, so I kinda just left it there. I know, I'm an asshole for that, but what am I supposed to do? I got back in my truck and left, and that's pretty much the end of that. To recap, I would say that when it stepped out onto the road, it seemed startled that my truck was there, and possibly did not know I was on the road so close when he had stepped out, like it was an accident. I maybe got a second to look at it before it looked right over at me, and then BAM! My truck hit this thing, collided, and I assume killed it on impact would be my best guess. A few years ago, in the fall, I had one of those Dogman sons of bitches steal a buck from right outside the back of my truck. Long story short, because I'm not going to feed you a 7-page encounter story, so I'll keep it really brief. Long story short, I got me a 4-pointer, tagged it, and stuck him in the back of my truck. This was a good-sized buck too, and I was going to bring it to my friend who's a taxidermist, because I wanted to keep the hide intact. But I guess that son of a bitch made sure that wasn't going to happen. I'm about 50 feet away from my truck, dealing with my tarps and getting them ready to cover my kill, as I hear my truck sitting down and what sounds like a boulder being thrown onto it, and I turn around and this dog-looking person, a dogman, reaches down from jumping up in the truck, grabs onto the buck with one hand, pulls it up and throws it over its shoulder in one fluid motion, all while turning and jumping into the trees with my kill. I can hardly believe what I just saw, so much so that my mouth was practically on the ground in sheer disbelief. This thing has never looked over at me, and it just grabbed its prize, or, well, my prize that it stole, and bolted into the woods. Of course, I screamed and hollered, but by the time I went to go get my gun out of the cab of my truck, it was long gone. This thing was fast, and I wasn't even afraid of the sheer size and speed of this thing, just pissed the fact that it took all my effort away. A month ago, I went over with my friends to some state gameland area that's near their house to walk around in because, well, we were bored and we're in quarantine, and there's not much else to do. We just wanted to explore miles upon miles of dense, dark woods. I'm 18, and I thought it would be a fairly good idea if I brought weapons with me, and any sort of supplies in case anything happened, because we were just wanting to explore, and also wanting to do it at night, where everything is in the blackness. I would like to think of us as a group of avid explorers. I, personally, love the thrill of being in danger sometimes, and wanted to make sure we were taken care of in case we ran into a cougar or some sort of predator. We got out there pretty far, and we were doing just fine with flashlights and the equipment that we had. We wanted to keep a lookout and make sure that we wouldn't run into any nocturnal animals like skunks or anything like that. The woods that we were traversing through were dense and covered with foliage and shortcut trees, but we were determined to get as much out of the night as we could. And the further we went into the wilderness without anything happening, the braver we became and the hungrier we got for a thrill. At one point or another, we came to a dead deer, a buck at that was partially eaten. It looked fresh too, and we were amazed at the size of this buck and how it was torn open. We got creeped out because that meant there was either a cougar around or a bunch of coyotes, both being something we weren't really wanting to deal with. As we were checking out this carcass with our flashlights and looking at it a little more, we hear a crunching of leaves behind us, and we all shone our lights. The first thing we saw is huge white teeth glistening in the light, and a gaping snout full of dripping saliva. That's when we quickly noticed the glowing amber eyes shortly above it, and that these teeth belonged to whatever it is we were looking at. We were looking at a real-life werewolf in front of us, and we didn't stick around to see what was going to happen. I think we all booked it out of there so fast we probably made a dust storm. We booked it so fast and never looked back to see if this thing was following us, but I don't think it ever did. We got back to our cars and floored it out of there so fast. I used to think that monsters didn't exist, but I feel like that night I was proven wrong. I don't know what the hell is out there that looks exactly like a werewolf, but whatever it was we ran into, I'm sorry this encounter is so brief, but there's not a whole lot to it other than what we saw and that we booked it. I can't give you more specific, exact details because it was just so quick, but I can tell you confidently that all four of us saw exactly the same thing, and we collectively speculate that whatever we saw was in the process of possibly eating this dead buck, or was coming upon the corpse to eat since it was still fresh. I believe it growled at us because it thought we were coming to take its food, or even posed a threat, and we weren't about that life, so we ditched. I was driving home late one night when I saw what looked to be like a large dog or canid-like humanoid thing run across the road in front of me and jumped off the guardrail. The first thing I noticed was a large shape that was standing upright and running on two legs in front of my vehicle, just outside the limits of my headlights. It's been cleared, the road, in only a matter of seconds and leapt off into the night. It was dark and I couldn't make out a fur color, but it looked to be a smoky charcoal color gray, if I could put my best guess in. The first thing I noticed was it to have pointed ears in the snout, which is what ultimately gave it away as canid. The disturbing part was that it was running on two legs, and just like a dog would, bound off the side of the road, off the guardrail, like it would if it was on four legs. I know there is such a thing as wild dogs and all that, but something in my gut just tells me this wasn't a wild dog. It also looked nothing like a wolf or what a wild dog would look like, and it was much larger. Plus, the fact that I don't think any breed of dog can walk steadily on two legs for really any amount of distance, at least not comfortably, without shaking. It freaked me right the hell out, and I kept driving, keeping to my own business, hoping it wasn't planning on coming after me. Never ever ever saw it again after that. So, I've been listening to scary stories and cryptid encounters for years now, and my family has never really believed me, because I myself am a big believer in them, even though I've never had any personal accounts, thank you God. But just recently, my good mate's brother told me about that he ran into one of these dog werewolf things, whatever the hell they are, when he went hunting back in the fall. He told me that he must have got to this buck first before this Dogman did, because, coincidentally, he thinks both him and the same creature were hunting the same buck. He claimed that it was pissed off and showed itself after he killed it, and even tried to go as far as attack him with the intent to kill. He let it take his kill and said he didn't want any part to play in fending that creature off. When I picked his brain about it for proof that he wasn't lying, he got really emotional and started freaking out, and his whole tone of voice changed. There's just a certain genuine and sincerity in somebody's tone when they're recalling a past traumatic experience that you can tell they're not lying. When he described it, he said it was hairy and had a longer snout, and it resembled the werewolves from the Underworld movies, is what he told me. Then he says it couldn't have been that though, because he knows that werewolves are fictional creatures and don't exist in the real world. So, what is it that he ran into? I think he ended his speculation with it with some sort of mutated or damaged or deranged wolf, or possibly mange, or even a hybrid. He doesn't know. Okay, I know you know a lot about Dogman, so I'm writing to you, asking for some help, and maybe even your viewers can help me. I have a barn, probably about a quarter-mile away from my house, and for whatever reason, stray cats love my land, and it never fails. Every spring, there always seems to be a new litter of kittens and cats that show up, so I always make it a thing to go out to the old barn and lay out some food and old blankets so they can make themselves a comfy home. I use some of the leftover straw and hay to kind of make it their own. Well, one night it was particularly windy and raining really hard, so I worried about them and wanted to make sure those little guys had plenty of food for the night, since it had been a few days since I checked up on them, and I didn't want them to go hungry or cold. I grabbed my flashlight and I walked out there, and as I get close to the barn, I'm hearing the cats start to go crazy, and I'm thinking to myself, what on earth? As I reach close to the barn, the door of it flings open, and this short, stubby little Dogman, no more than 4.5 feet tall, runs out and stares at me right in the face like a deer caught in the headlights kind of look. I noticed immediately the dead cat in its mouth and 2 more in its hands. It just stares at me for a quick second, not moving a muscle, as if frozen, like caught up doing something that it shouldn't. While holding on to all 3 dead cats, it flies down onto all 4s and sprints off into the darkness far beyond the barn. Without even hesitating, I run into the barn to make sure the cats are okay, and there are a few missing, which wasn't too abnormal. They come and go at night and day, but in all, there is around 8 or so, and I was only seeing about 4 during this time. Usually, this time of night is when they all congregate in the barn and sleep, so I don't know if they're from the same litter or what, but either way, their numbers continue to shrink after that. The lowest the number got was probably 1 or 2 cats that I ever kept seeing, and the other ones kind of just disappeared after that. But like I said, there was always at least 1 or 2 cats around no matter what. I don't know for sure if that Dogman saw that it was a free meal and broke in or what. I want to hunt that thing down, but if it's a young one, that means there's probably a mom and a dad somewhere close by, and I really don't want to feel parental wrath because I obliterated their child with a 12 gauge for going after my cats. Anyway, I want to mention to you that I've had a few other encounters with Dogmen, which is why I know about them, and for whatever reason, there's this connection between me and them now, to where I encounter them on somewhat of a timely basis. It's very strange. It's like once you see one or have an encounter with one, or more than encounter, it's like once you see one or have an encounter with one, more encounters will follow suit, and I'm not sure why that is. I had an absolutely terrifying dinner over at my girlfriend's parents' house just a few years ago. My girlfriend's parents live out in the high desert, and near their house, there is a large canyon that feeds into a smaller river down at the bottom. Since it is high desert, there's lots of locust trees, mild brush, and it's fairly open with only minor tree coverage. I know sometimes they will get coyotes and possibly even mountain lions, but I don't really know what else. I mention these things to you because I'm not exactly sure what we encountered that night. Whatever it was spooked the hell out of my girlfriend and her parents and I. It hasn't happened since to my knowledge, but either way, it was quite the experience. So, we are over for dinner, having a great time socializing with her parents, and we had just finished having dessert. We're sitting around her living room talking when we begin to hear coyotes off in the distance. We all just sit there quietly, and I mentioned to her father that, wow, the coyotes are really acting up tonight, I see. And he just kind of chuckles and says, yeah, you'll hear them quite often, and they'll usually yip and yap from time to time. About 3 or so seconds later, we all heard the most powerful and horrific wolf howl we have ever heard. Or at least that's the closest animal we could attach it to. It sounded like a wolf howl, but on steroids. It was so loud. We all looked at each other confused when her father and I both, at the same time, said, "What the hell was that?" and we get up to try and look out the window, but nothing. It sounded so close by, but it's so dark outside, and her parents only have seldom lights around their property. I asked him if there's any wolves around here, and he said there hasn't been any for a long time. But he said that howl sounded like it came from something bigger than a wolf. This is where things get even creepier. We continue on with the night in conversation, and probably a good 15 or 20 minutes later, that pack of coyotes was much closer to the house. This time, they started to go off in a crying, crazy frenzy, whimpering in a giant chorus of coyotes. Her dad and I were bamboozled at what the hell we were hearing, and so both of us stepped outside to see if we can get any sort of clue or inkling to what was going on. But nothing. We could tell that these coyotes were often in the woodline, whooping and hollering, and making all sorts of racket. We figured that they had gotten a kill, which is why all the commotion was going on around the distant. But this sounded different than your typical coyote whooping and hollering. They were afraid and crying, yipping and yapping and whining. It was strange and very disturbing to say the least. Her father and I stood outside listening for some time, with my girlfriend begging us to come back in, and that she did not feel safe, while me and him tried to comfort her, telling her it was all right. It went quiet after a while, and we sat there, talking, trying to speculate what it was we were hearing exactly and what was going on. I found it fascinating, even though I was a little creeped out, I'm not gonna lie. That's when all the hairs on my head and arms started to stand up, like I felt like I was in danger. Once again, her father broke the silence and said, "Do you feel that?" And I said, "What?" He said, "We need to go inside now. We're being watched." Without hesitating, I took both steps inside the house and asked him, "By what?" And I'll never forget the way he looked me in the eyes with the most stern and serious expression and just told me, "I don't know." The rest of the night, my girlfriend and I just sat down and watched some Netflix to try and forget about the whole thing. I'm not too sure what her father and mother did, but I'm assuming they kept busy inside because neither of them went back out. I think things quieted down or so, I think. The next morning, her father woke me up in a daze and said, "You gotta come see this now." Still dazed and groggy from waking up on a funky REM cycle spot, my girlfriend and I stumbled up out of bed to see what her dad was talking about. All along the large pasture, just a little ways out from their house in perfect view, was a clear view of this coyote bloodbath. There were dead coyotes strung all throughout the field. We all said a few choice words that I'm not going to repeat, but you can guess them. We ran out to the field to properly assess the damage, and we noticed that these coyotes had literally been torn to pieces. I'm not talking about just one or two coyotes. I'm talking about at least a dozen or so, it looked like. There were more chunks of flesh and meat than there were whole coyotes. I don't have an explanation for what happened, but I know it really bothered my girlfriend's father, based on his reactions and him kind of shutting down for the rest of the day. I had to pitch in and give him a hand on cleaning up that mess, and what a shit show that was, but we got it done. I really don't have an explanation for what happened, and I kinda just like to play it off as an overly aggressive mountain lion that got too close to those coyotes over food or something, but I'll never really know. Plus, there's really no explanation for that loud howl that we heard. I'm just thankful that I don't have any of that where I live, and I don't have to deal with it.